All right. Darrick, it is my honor to be in conversation with you today.
It's mutual, Natalie.
Well, your work on economic rights and on an inclusive economy has really shaped my own thinking and work over the years. And a huge part of what resonates with me is the North Star that your work provides us. So thank you for that. Give us, before we dig into the substance, give us the 1-2 on how you got into this work.
Yeah, and I like to begin every panel and every talk with gratitude. And gratitude to you, your leadership, gratitude to the Economic Security Project, gratitude to all the partners and the people in the audience. And the answer to your question has to do with movement, has to do with recognition that we need partners in this space. We need people committed to common agendas in the space in a cooperative rather than competitive way. And then here's one of the more special things, and I suspect you'll get this vibe throughout this panel: fellowship. I adore you, Natalie. I benefit from the fellowship we have, your friendship. So that makes the work better. That makes the work more trusting. And that is indeed stuff that we actually have to invest in. It doesn't simply happen naturally. So sometimes that means staying an extra hour if you're engaging with somebody. We need to invest in each other when we're doing this movement.
Yeah.
So how did I get into this space? I don't know exactly. Some of it perhaps you're born with. Some of it perhaps there's structures that lead you to it. One thing I do know, it's some combination of the two. When we talk about, say, diversity and inclusion, without a doubt, when I'm in these spaces, I have some things in common with the people in the spaces, but some things I don't have in common with them. And that very much might be some of the stuff that compels me. I grew up in Bedford-Stuyvesant before we had the $2 million homes in Bedford-Stuyvesant. So I like to brag that I am economic development, not gentrification. So that's my one little liner. But nonetheless, I also had access to privilege. I went to Brooklyn Friends School, which is a Quaker school that's committed to an ethical education, also a highly resourced education that provides me a great deal of access. So in those two environments, I could certainly see that, and this is not cliche, it is foundational, that my peers in both environments were fundamentally the same. You had some people that were mischievous, some people that were leaders, some people that were just simply givers, and you see that in both environments. One of, I guess some of this gets personal and hard, but one of the people who mentored me, who I'd play football with, ended up incarcerated for robbing something. And this person was a leader, like any stretch of the imagination. Then I got other friends that end up being investment bankers. So without being long-winded, let me just sum it up. The one thing that was critical and clear, the difference between those two environments as well as individuals was resources. So at some point, it clicks on, especially as you move on in life, that fundamentally a lot of this is about resources. And then here's another word I suspect we're going to talk a lot about: power. Power, agency. And resources is one key element to give people power, the ability to impact their life outcomes, to be able to have agency.
Yeah.
How'd you get into this space?
Well, I'm the daughter of a preacher from Kansas, and when you grow up in a preacher's house, you really grow up in an organizing family. You just don't have that language. People are in and out of the door. You're trying to, save souls to get to heaven. And I think as my relationship to my faith changed, I took a lot of those organizing instincts I had and applied it to really trying to build God's love here on earth. And believe in organizing as a way of, being and helping people create the conditions to have the power and agency to live the lives that they want. So I spent the first part of my career thinking about how the internet can mobilize people in new ways, and the latter part thinking about how we move ideas and how ideas can build power for people. Yeah. So that's my story.
And I know we're going to get into issues. We're going to get into structures and everything like that. But, Senator Nina Turner quotes Martin Luther King a lot and talks about power and love and how they're both reinforcing and both necessary. So, I don't think we should be afraid of using terms like love and power. Yeah. In fact, a constraint that we have is that we don't own our values the way we should. That it's almost as if you're talking about things that are going to uplift people, that if you're talking about equity, justice, that somehow you're not being technical. You're not one of the smart kids or the reasonable people in the room. When in fact, there is no endeavor that doesn't begin with a set of values. It is a dishonest project to think that you can talk about economics irrespective of values.
I really couldn't agree with you more. This is one of the things I've learned so much from you is sometimes the simplest question is the most important question. And you're known as a man who can go deep on policy, right? Like you pioneered stratification economics, one of the pioneers of stratification economics, which is really another way for us to understand how inequality persists across race and gender and other lines. You are the intellectual father of baby bonds, as one Bloomberg reporter recently mused. And you've written many seminal papers on a jobs guarantee, one with us on a racially inclusive guaranteed income. So you know how to go deep on questions. But one thing I've heard you ask before that I'm going to turn to you, which is, I think, one of the most powerful questions. What is the purpose of an economy?
That's right. And if you were here all day, you saw the video that came out of the Institute. We try to, frame that question and then answer it. But it is critical that we don't ask that question enough. I bet a lot of people in this audience has had economics. I dare say that class probably didn't even begin with the question of what is the purpose of an economy. They might have asked what is economics, but they didn't ask what is the purpose of an economy. And as we have been talking, it is something that we do get to choose. We get to define the economy that we want. We get to ground it in a set of values. And if we were to begin with that question, we very well might have something different than we have right now. So if I were to define a purpose of an economy, I would say that an economy should be investing in its most treasured and valuable resources. And what is that? People and the environments in which they live. Not just from, and I shouldn't say just, but not only from a perspective of it is the right thing to do. I mean, if it's not about people and the places we live, then what are we talking about? Isn't this about humanity, yeah. Right? But then there's another point. It actually turns out that is our most productive resource. That when you think of resources being directed in functional ways towards people, it facilitates ingenuity. Mm-hmm. It facilitates people to reap the rewards of their efforts. And then here's again the fundamental purpose. It enables people to have power, to be self-determining in righteous ways. And then we have spillover effects. We get tranquility. The tragedies going on in our world today, the violence, the despair. It turns out that when resources are going towards people and we're building infrastructure, like the secretary was describing, it promotes tranquility. It leads to peace. I dare say that would be our best foreign policy. If we were expending resources in productive ways to build up infrastructure, home and abroad, that promotes human flourishing. And it's not simply pie in the sky. This is real.
Yeah. Well, so that's the purpose of an economy. What is the government's role in ensuring it?
Right, and that's the secondary question, right? So we have a purpose, we define it, then, what is the fiduciary of government? What should government do? Well, government has a responsibility to steer that investment. We talk a lot about now industrial policy. Industrial policy rightfully has elevated itself to one of the pinnacles of our conversation. But we have never been in a period where we haven't had industrial policy. When Ronald Reagan was issuing his tax cuts and his narrative about small government, that's industrial policy. That is the strategic direction of government resource for industrious or economic purpose. It is not an industrial policy that I adopt. It is not an industrial policy that centers people, but it is industrial policy. So government has a fiduciary to use their industrial policy, their industrial power, to structure resources and rules so that people can have agency, and hence the guarantee, right? That you presented a model in your book of what government can be doing in order to promote an economy where we all flourish.
Yeah. And I think that's what's new in this moment of bold new consensus, is that we're naming this is what government needs to do, and we're honest about it, right? To your point, we have always had government activity, but we've told a very different story over the last 45 years. And this time it's different, right? You hear Secretary Pete talking about what government's role is in ensuring equity from the stage. So one of the other things that comes up a lot in your work is reciprocity. And the poet Natalie spoke to that earlier on the video so beautifully. And I think that speaks to a relationship of accountability and mutuality. And in some ways, we understand this concept really well in our own personal lives. We understand it at home, in our personal relationships, at home with chores, the concept of reciprocity with families. But we struggle to bring that mutuality and that reciprocity to scale. What do we need to do to bring that back into our story of the economy?
Yeah, and I got a big smile when you mentioned Natalie Diaz, because that woman is brilliant. It also speaks to the point that what we're doing is going to take many people from many disciplines, many perspectives. We need a poet talking about political economy. You mentioned your family background in spirituality and theology. We need more preachers talking about economic policy, and we need more economists talking about values and morals. This is necessary. So,
say that line again. More preachers talking about the economy, and more economists talking about values.
Absolutely. I mean, and again, we can look history. Some of the biggest social movements we've had in our world has been grounded by a theologian class. And that's right, it should be. Economics, before its current evolution, a lot of the economists were considered moral philosophers. We need to get back to that, in my view. But perhaps, and I'm going a little bit aside, apologies, the ingredient that we haven't had historically was affirmative inclusion. So even when we've had perspectives of a more moral-based economy, and we can look at the New Deal, we can look at the Marshall Plan. That's what I was alluding to when I was talking about foreign policy investments. I was alluding to the fact that after the destruction of World War II, there was intentionality in building up the infrastructure of Europe to ensure that we wouldn't have World War III. But here's what didn't take place. It was not affirmatively inclusive. There was many nations that we now call in the global South that certainly suffered a great deal from World War II and certainly participated in World War II and were excluded from that type of infrastructure development. In the United States, when we built an asset-based middle class with the GI Bill, where essentially 8 out of 10 men born were involved in World War II and benefited from the GI Bill and could get things like that we're talking about today. Tuition-free college education. could get a down payment on a home, could get access to job training with essentially a job guarantee for them. Those things we actually did, but we didn't do them in a racially inclusive way. And not only is that wrong, but it left us vulnerable for what we have today, which is a backlash where from a political frame, we were able to say that these undeserving others now are getting government handouts in ways that are unfair and unrighteous. So what I'm trying to allude to is that not simply for interest convergence, we have to commit to affirmative inclusion in this new vision. We have to make sure for both righteous economic reasons as well as political reasons that we intentionally design, manage, and implement policies that make sure that everybody is included.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. So let's stay sort of on the global. You took us, to the countries after World War II. I want to talk for a second about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted 75 years ago, and it set forth civil, social, and economic rights. And you've pointed out that we've made great strides on civil rights and social rights, but we have strayed from the path of economic rights. And as we've continued to focus on, profit over abundance in our economy. So why is that? And where do you see some hope?
Yeah, so, 2 points. One is the context by which the Universal Declaration of Human Rights had arisen was one of despair, one of destruction, one of the near fascist takeover of our world. And out of that, there was a recognition of a doubling down in the rights of people. And as you described, Natalie, there were 5 of them: civil, political, social, cultural, and economic rights. And in that declaration, a lot of what we're saying today, it ain't so new, nor is it so radical. You can go back to that declaration and see almost verbatim some of the words that we use today in describing this bold new consensus. That's not it. You can also look at some of the civil rights doctrine and find that there was an understanding that politics, economics were not separable. Also, affirmative inclusion was not separable from all 3 of those. Mm-hmm. So what we've ended up having over the years, and I think because we didn't do it in an inclusive way, we've had a political backlash that has not only had an inadequate notion of what freedom and justice is by characterizing political rights, civil rights, and then property rights, the rights of property, not the economic rights of people, but the economic rights of property, devoid of an adequate understanding of how that property came to be distributed in the first place. So that has come to be our normative perspective. And we know that we are inadequate in even instilling civil rights and political rights, but nonetheless, they're not controversial. Not only is that inadequate, and why is it inadequate? Because the right to vote, the right to civilly organize, the right for your property to be protected is limited if you're hungry. It is limited if you do not have a home to live in. It is limited if you don't have access to an education. So it's not only limited, it's not only incomplete, it's a co-optation of what justice and freedom is. It has co-opted our notions. It has characterized the state as freedom in the concept of freedom from a tyrannical state, freedom to choose. But it's inauthentic. It is, again, a co-optation because you have no choice if you have no resources. You are at the whim of somebody's charitable inkling, or you're at the vulnerability of their exploitation. So we're talking about a new North Star, or we're talking about a more honest North Star, one that has the rights of people that inclusive of some resource so that you very well have some agency in your life.
And where are you seeing this conversation growing? So you're talking about an economic bill of rights.
Two things. One, we should recognize it's the 75th anniversary of that UN Declaration of Human Rights. And I think there's a growing recognition after what we've gone through over the last 50 years that, and young people are leading the way. There's a recognition that people need resources and governments have a fiduciary to provide those resources. So the movement is building. Now, there's risk and vulnerability that it might go the other way, but there's movement that's building. And there's been some Overtons that have facilitated this movement to build. And I'm going to flip it on you. And I think I'm going to pause from screaming at y'all for a moment.
This is class, Professor. You are taking us to school.
I'm going to ask Natalie the question. What's different about where we were when this was described as bold versus old in 2016 versus today?
Yeah, well, that was 4 years ago. And I've been thinking a lot about that. It was very much the primary of ideas. We had then Mayor Pete running, and he was running on some big ideas, as was candidate Kamala Harris, as was, candidate Cory Booker. There were a number of people who showed up to showcase what essentially were economic rights.
I can't help but give a shout out to Bernie Sanders.
Yes. Yes. Well, then I can't help but give a shout out to Elizabeth Warren.
I like that too.
But there's an adage that says in a crisis, the ideas that are lying around get picked up, and that is what creates change. Now, that is a Milton Friedman quote, and I think he'd get a kick out of being named on this stage. But his quote couldn't be more true, that there were ideas lying around, and we showcased them 4 years ago. The primary of ideas ran on them, and so many people in this room have spent their lives dedicated to building that movement to get to the point where here's a plan for a guarantee of college, a college guarantee. Here is a plan for an income guarantee or guaranteed income. Here's a plan for a guaranteed job. The guarantees were ideas that were laying around, and then when the crisis hit, a pandemic, these ideas were picked up. And so many of them, right, we saw glimmers of so many of them.
I mean, we essentially had guaranteed income during the pandemic. We essentially, especially as it related to access to the COVID-19 vaccine, had guaranteed health care during the pandemic. We had a moratorium on evictions and foreclosures. We had a moratorium on student loan debt payment. So we did these big, bold ideas. Like, we have not told that story. During the pandemic, and then here's the other counterfactual from that pandemic. What if we didn't do it? Where would we be right now if we didn't do those big, bold things? We would be in a Great Depression. I mean, we would be in a Great Depression. We literally made the righteous decision. I don't want to say we suspended the economy in order for people to stay home and be protected from the virus, because that's oxymoronic, because you have no economy if people are not alive. But in order to save lives, right?
That is the purpose of an economy, after all.
Exactly.
People.
Right. So in order to save lives, we did big, bold things, and not only did we survive it, it perhaps was one of the shortest recessions on record. I mean, yeah.
Let's talk about that interplay a little bit more between sort of the ideas, the power, and the policy making, starting with guaranteed income, where you had, Aisha Yandaro in Jackson, Mississippi, and Mayor Michael Tubbs in Stockton, California, giving, in Stockton, $500 a month with no strings attached to families in Stockton to show what it would mean for agency and freedom in people's lives. Fast forward into a pandemic, Congress would pass the expanded child tax credit that if you have 2 kids, would send a check for $500 a month with no strings attached within weeks of Congress, passing that bill. And it went from idea to national policy so fast. What does that tell you? You're an economist who has talked about big ideas for a long time. And what did you make of the speed at which that happened?
Yeah, I mean, economics is not devoid of politics, not devoid of what you described as that Overton moment, and we had the ideas ready. But, we can also tell the backlash story. So, we're celebrating. This is about some celebration, but we shouldn't get ready to spike the football just yet, because in the end, we didn't get the refundable child tax credit as something permanent as part of IRA. But yet we saw the evidence from it that it was not only valuable from an economic security project standpoint, but here's the other point we need to recognize. It was economically enhancing in ways that made for dynamism that benefited not just the recipient, but the entire economy. That form of stimulus is going towards productive use, that it enables people to have choices to benefit from their actions, right? And I hope I'm articulating this well, but here's what I'm trying to get to is that this is not simply charitable resource spending. It is productive use of resources. That's the point.
Well, and it's true that we did not get yet the federal expanded child tax credit, but it is also true that states are leading the way. So, one of the things that happens is when there's a big spotlight, we know, okay, we didn't get the expanded child tax credit, but while nobody's looking, the organizers are organizing. And we're set to triple the number of states by 2025 who have a child tax credit on their books, and pushing it to be as big and bold and expansive as possible. And so I hope that come 20 years from now, when people are here at Cooper Union imagining the next, wave of what America can be, that we have that federal expanded child tax credit.
I love it. And Natalie, you bringing that up also is rekindling in me the times when we first met. We were talking about two policies at the time. You were talking about guaranteed income, and I was talking a lot about a federal jobs guarantee. And we might have been positioned on a panel where it was a debate, a friendly debate, a debate where we both were committed to justice. We both began with a certain value standpoint, but we spent a lot of time describing why our policy was better than the other. So that's a problem. That's a mistake, and we have evolved. And the evolution came because we had interactions. We were able to engage. But I want to caution all of us that in the end, there is no silver bullet, that it's going to take all of these policies that we're describing that are enabling in such a way that without them, you don't have agency in your life, that a movement does not get us caught up in so issue-myopic focus that we compete with each other rather than trying to achieve that North Star. So, I think
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so along those lines, we've talked about jobs earlier with the labor leaders, and now talking about the jobs guarantee and wages and dignity. We've talked about guaranteed income and non-labor income. Let's also talk about wealth, right? And that's where so much of your work has been, at the intersection of wealth building and the racial wealth gap. And one of the big ideas that we've also seen move is that of a baby bond or an inheritance guarantee, that every child should have a risk-taking nest egg to start their life, to start a job, to start a business, to pursue the type of education that they want. And you've really pioneered that. So talk to us about how you've seen that move over the last several years.
Yeah, and it's growing like wildfires. Shout out to Connecticut, Treasurer Wooden, as well as Treasurer Russell, which again, if we're talking about movement space, Treasurer Wooden was the treasurer who started baby bonds in Connecticut, and then Treasurer Russell succeeded him and took this on in ways that doesn't always occur. Oftentimes you have politicians talking about their big, bold ideas, but that transition was remarkable. So in this movement space, you have to have leaders that are willing to do the right thing. And again, baby bonds is an investment in a child at birth, and I was intentional in using that word investment, so that when they become a young adult, when they reach adulthood, they have a nest egg, they have a resource base, they have some capital, some seed capital to put them in an asset that can passively appreciate over their life. And frankly, that's how wealth is generally built for the vast majority of people in the United States who have wealth. They begin with a down payment for a home. They begin with an education without debt that puts them in a managerial or professional occupation with a 401k, an automatic retirement savings, or they have some seed capital to start a business and innovate from either their skill set or their ideas to have that business. Without any of that seed capital, however smart, however ingenious you may be, you will be limited to reap the rewards of those things I've described. So what baby bonds is basically democratizing access to wealth as a birthright, as simply because you're born, you will have access to these things. So that's one example. And Connecticut and Washington, D.C. have led the way at the local level. Shout out to Cory Booker and Ayanna Presley at the federal level for that legislation. But because this is a movement, various other states are poised to pass it. Massachusetts, there's conversations in Washington. Seemingly conservative states are also thinking about it. So again, this is a movement. This is part of a larger picture of a movement where we couple it with child tax credits. We shouldn't be competing them with each other. So the question is where to invest all of it. We need to invest in all of it because there is no silver bullet. So, income is a concept that is valuable and useful. It allows you to deal with your periodic payments. Wealth is a different concept. Wealth, and all of this is functional, by the way. All of this is an input to one's agency. Wealth affords people the ability to make large decisions. If I wanted to become a culinary chef, I could leave my job and do it if I have wealth. If I was faced with an expensive medical procedure, I could use some wealth. By the way, we need universal health care, but
another guarantee.
Another guarantee. So let me stop rambling, but nonetheless, we need these economic Bill of Rights. It's not an infinite list, but there's a finite list of goods and services that should not be rationed by the price system. Their quantity, their quality, and access to them should not be rationed by what we define as a market or a price mechanism. We've had a conversation before because without these goods, people are so vulnerable that they don't have agency in their lives.
Right. It's the stability that we need. Thank you for walking through an economic Bill of Rights and how we guarantee things for people. Thank you so much, Darrick.